You know, for decades, we've basically been told to think of inflation as this big, scary economic monster. It's the thing that chews up our savings, and it's the job of central banks to go out and slay it, no matter what. The goal is always price stability, period.
But what if that's just too simple? Way back in 1974, an economist named Anthony Thirlwall said something pretty radical. He suggested that in our big war against inflation, we might be hitting the wrong target and accidentally taking out something really important, economic growth itself.
And that right there is the huge question that a recent economic study decided to dig into. The researchers wanted to know if this obsessive focus on keeping inflation super, super low might actually be putting the brakes on what an economy can do, especially in the developing world. So let's dive into what they found.
All right, so first things first, let's just quickly go over the standard playbook. Why does everyone think inflation is public enemy number one to begin with? I mean, the textbook argument makes a lot of sense, right? When prices are all over the place, it's really hard for families or businesses to plan for the future. It can push people to gamble on risky stuff instead of making solid long-term investments. And, of course, the big one, it just destroys the value of your savings, which can lead to some serious unrest. So to fight this enemy, central banks around the globe landed on this big strategy that really took over in the last part of the 20th century, inflation targeting. The idea is pretty straightforward. The central bank just picks a number for inflation that it thinks is low and stable, like 2 or 3%, and then uses its main weapon, interest rates, to try and steer the economy right to that target. Okay, and this brings us to a perfect real-world experiment. A bunch of countries in Latin America adopted this exact strategy. But the results, well, they ended up creating a real puzzle. So picture this. After dealing with absolutely crippling hyperinflation, big economies like Brazil, Chile, Colombia, and Mexico decided to go all in on this inflation targeting idea around the early 2000s. And you know, for the next 20 years or so, they did a pretty good job of taming that price monster. But here's the mystery. The boom times, that dynamic growth they were promised, it just never really showed up. Instead, a lot of these economies just kind of flatline. And this chart here kind of gives you their report card. It shows you how often each country actually managed to stay inside its inflation target zone. As you can see, Chile did really well, hitting their goal almost 3/4 of the time. The others, like Mexico and Colombia, were more of a coin flip, hitting it about half the time. But the key thing to get here is that compared to the chaos they had before, this was a massive, massive improvement. They did what the rulebook said. So this is the billion-dollar question, isn't it? If they basically won the war on inflation, where was the victory party? Why didn't the economy boom? This slow growth suggested that maybe something else was going on, which brings us to two totally different ways of looking at the problem. Let's break down the two competing ideas at the heart of this whole debate. You've got the established view, and then you have the challenger. On one side, you've got the standard central bank view. The whole philosophy here is that stable prices are the bedrock of a healthy economy. End of story. In this world, inflation is almost always caused by an overheating economy, too much demand. So the solution is simple. You hike interest rates to cool things down. But then, on the other side, you've got this challenger view. It says, hang on a second. Inflation isn't always about too much demand. Sometimes it's just a side effect of growth, like wages going up, as an economy develops. And if you slam on the brakes with high interest rates every single time that happens, you might be killing the very growth you're trying to create. So the big argument, the whole point of this research, is basically this. By being so laser-focused on hitting a very specific, very low inflation number, are central banks making a hidden trade-off? Are they giving up real-world growth and actual jobs just to hit an arbitrary target on a spreadsheet? And this is where this study gets really, really cool, because they didn't just float this as an idea. They went looking for the numbers. They tried to find the actual inflation sweet spot. So what these researchers did was take 18 years of economic data from these 4 countries, and they just crunched the numbers with one simple goal: to figure out the exact inflation rate that lined up with the absolute highest level of economic growth. And wow, check out what they found. This table says it all. In every single country, the inflation rate that would have produced the most growth was way higher than the official target the central bank was aiming for. I mean, look at Colombia. The best rate for growth was more than 2 points higher. For Mexico and Chile, it was over 1.5 points higher. It suggests that if growth was the main goal, they were aiming way too low. To make this crystal clear, let's just zoom in on Mexico for a second. The official target is 3%, But the data says the economy's engine runs fastest when inflation is around 4.58%. That's not a small difference. In the world of monetary policy, that is a huge gap.
So, what does a gap like that actually mean in the real world? Who cares about a percentage point here or there? Well, this is where we see the potential cost of being too strict. Using their model, the researchers could actually predict what Mexico's growth would probably look like under these two different inflation scenarios. And the difference is, honestly, it's pretty shocking. At its official inflation target of 3%, the model predicts that Mexico's economy would grow at a pathetic 0.23% a year. I mean, that's barely moving. It's practically standing still. But if the central bank had allowed inflation to run a bit hotter at that optimal 4.58% rate, the predicted annual growth jumps all the way to 2.29%. That's literally 10 times higher. It suggests the country might be leaving a massive amount of prosperity on the table by keeping policy too tight. So, what's the big takeaway from all this? Now, hold on. This is not an argument to just let inflation rip. Nobody wants to go back to the days of hyperinflation. The whole point here is about nuance. It's about recognizing that for a developing economy that needs to invest and build, a little bit of inflation might just be the sound of the engine working. It might be a side effect of healthy growth, not a disease. And if you try to stamp it out completely, you might just be stamping out that growth along with it. And that leaves us with one final, really powerful question to chew on. Having stable prices is a good thing for sure, but this research forces us to ask, what's the right price to pay for it? And if the cost is potentially a decade of lost growth, maybe it's time to rethink the target.